Once again, salutations to everyone. Thank you so much for coming on to this channel, this tactical intellectual channel. We have a presentation on the Melanated French, or as the title says, Noir and Brun. And that right there just means black and brown, to put it into terms that we use for today. Melanated, swarthy, brunette, noir, and brune, or noir and brune to anglify it. But anyway, let's get into this presentation here. Enjoy. So before we get the ball rolling informationally, let's go over the previous sources that we've already seen in other presentations. So now in this book, Riddles of Prehistoric Times right here, keep in mind on page 57 what it says right there, and 58. Now we're talking about France as a country right here, the origins of that area. So as you can indeed see on page 57 right there, is making that whole connection between the dark Welshmen and the black Celts, and towards the bottom is talking about the Basque and how they're of darker complexion right there. Going into page 58 is basically saying that these people right here, France, I'm keying in on France right there, but it's talking about the first inhabitants of France right there. And then you drop down and it says that they had dark complexion, they were an African people, and then they were dark, they were stunted, or short, smaller people right there. So alright, so that takes us to the book The Place of the Welsh right there. So on page 8 towards the bottom, you can see that it talks about how the small dark Welshman is identical to the small dark Basque of the Western Pyrenees, both French and Spanish. So that's a check mark right there. So then on page 9, it talks about how, so they're talking about on the continent. So they say that this small dark Welshman is a fragment of people formerly widely extended over Europe, but we're going to get into that later, but we're just talking about the building blocks right here, the original people before they were broken up into ethnological islands by different invasions. So then you go over to page 16, and then it mentions how it talks about the small dark element that it proved to be a fragment of the Iberian race that occupied the whole of Britain and France. That's what we want to get at right there. So that's another check mark or token of confirmation right there. So now let's get into the main course right here. Now before I really do that, turn your attention to this keynote slide here, and we're looking at the sources that shapes my opinion regarding the French beginnings. Now I'm going to look at the Races of Europe, the Racial History of Man book, Environment, Race, and Migration, Sex and Race, Volume 1, Riddles of Prehistoric Times, we already looked at that, and The Place of the Welsh in the History of Britain, we already looked at that. So we're going to go into the beginnings of the French people, and then we're going to go into the middle period where we discuss the how should I put it, the saturation. That's an HVAC term. That just means that different elements that's blended together before everything becomes one single entity or type of people, and that's the modern day, if you know what I mean. Alright, so we're going to go into the book Sex and Race Volume 1, and we're going to read certain portions so that we can get things in a proper context, so that we can know about the beginnings of France and what type of people made up the beginnings. So now we're back into the book Sex and Race. We're going to look at chapter 19, Miscegenation in France. It says, next to Spain and Portugal, France has had the most miscegenation. The first known inhabitants of France were, as was said, the Grimaldi. In the 3rd century BC, Hannibal and his Africans penetrated into France as far as Tarascon. In the 8th century AD, the Moors swept through it as far as Tours, 140 miles from Paris, from where they were driven back by Charles Martel. In 1610 came another invasion of Moors, a peaceful one, which over 1 million of them, who had been expelled from Spain, settled in southern France at the invitation of Henry IV. The result is that the French in the region nearest Spain, especially the Auvergnats, are Negroid. There is a strong Negroid or Negro cast to many Auvergnese, says John Gunther. So we're going to stop here. So here's a short summary of chapter 19. We have overall 3 distinct waves of Negro melanated people going into geographic France. The first wave was also known as the first inhabitants of France, period. These were the Grimaldi people. So in the 3rd century BC, we know Hannibal had a lot of African soldiers and people around him. They went into France and did their thing. So in the 8th century, the Moors, the second well-known Moors, the Muslim Moors, not the regular Marus people that just means melanated people, but these are the Moors that had the banner of Islam that they were representing. They went into France and inhabited and set up shop there. So yeah, let's go ahead and go into the book Racial History of Man by Roland Dixon, so we can reinforce the information that we just read previously. Okay, so now in the book Racial History of Man, we're going to be checking out chapter 1, page 46. The subheading is France and the Low Countries. We're definitely dealing with France right now. So we're going to move on to page 47, and I'm going to do some reading and commenting throughout until I'm done with this France topic. And we're going to just check out the more important pieces of information and whatever commentary I have that can add or put things in context. I'm going to do that. So let's go ahead and start on page 47. So in France, caves and rock shelters were searched. They found skeletal remains there. The profile of the people during that time period were people short of stature, dolichocephalic skulls, broad noses. They referred to them as proto-australoid people. And then you also see that it said that a brachycephalic influence was found in that area. They classified that brachycephalic influence as Mongoloid type people. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, we see that during the Aurignacian period, the Mediterranean type is seen in that area. And they also note that the Mediterranean type and Caspian type people, they had some type of admixture going on. Also, at the close of the Paleolithic age, they mention that a third dolichocephalic type, the Caspian type people, came onto the scene in geographic France. So you see that there's a Mediterranean presence, a Caspian type. And they mentioned that they came into France through Germany. So going to page 48, it mentions that the Paleolithic types, they were basically exclusively dolichocephalic people. So they blended with brachycephalic people, but in the highlighted portion right here, it says many hundreds of crania have been excavated from these sites. So we're going into page 49, the bottom portion. Now, the information noted on page 49 mentions that when it comes to the geographic location, it's talking about the eastern portion of the Paris Basin. They say that 3 dolichocephalic types are found, and the one in higher numbers, the highest numbers, are the Mediterranean people, then the Caspian type people, and then guess what it says? That of the Grotte de Colgi, these types are almost absent, and in their stead we find a large proto-Negroid element. So there's a Negro element, or there's one of your Negro elements there. So we're going into page 50 with a trace of the proto-Australoid. So you got that proto-Australoid Negro mix there. And then the older rather than later Paleolithic forms. So on page 50, the bottom portion, the highlighted portion, it tells you that it was the latter part of the Paleolithic period that saw 2 new types of people make their appearance, Mediterranean and Caspian. And then when you go a little bit down, they say that it is probable that a second stream followed up the coast from Spain. So these Mediterranean people, they met and absorbed the Proto-Australoid and Proto-Negro peoples. Now keep in mind that all these people are dark skinned here. Mediterranean, Proto-Australoid, Proto-Negroid. So they absorbed, that means, they just blended and amalgamated with one another. So that's confirmation there. We can move on to page 51. Well, the end of page 50 say that, okay, with these movements of the 2 dolichocephalic groups, okay, so we introduced the brachycephalic, palealpine, and alpine types. And the location of this area, the geographic location, is the Central European highlands. So they poured into Paris, the Paris Basin. Okay, see on page 51. So when it goes past 51 into pages 52 and beyond, we start getting into the Bronze Age and then other later periods. So right now I wanted to establish the Paleolithic and Neolithic time periods, because that's the foundation, the melanated Negro foundations of France. So we're gonna bring up that notebook and we're gonna show that the early French peoples were made up or comprised of Proto-Australoid, Mongoloid, that Proto-Negro, Proto-Australoid blend, and really Proto-Negro in there too, Mediterranean, Palealpine, and Alpine people. So now we get to start talking about individuals and people that set up the civilizations and how they lived back in those times, and those are Negro peoples in Paris. Well, not Paris, but in France. All right, so now we're going to transfer over from racial history of man to the book Environment, Race, and Migration. And with this one, we're strictly dealing with the origins of the people of geographic France. So it's a lot of information to unpack, but we just want to pick out the racial makeup of the country or the territory. So we're going to revisit other parts later on when it's dealing with settlement and migration. But in the meantime, racial makeup. So on page 171, we see that it's talking about the Basque people, and they are broad-headed alpine type people there. So okay, and it mentions that overlap or commonality with France and Spain Basque population. So it mentions that I'm gonna read this part. It says possibly neither were the original speakers of Basque, just as it is certain that the Scottish Highlanders are not the same race as the original speakers of Gaelic. So, I mean, that's something that, you know, you need to remember, because it's going to come up again, and it's going to be referring to more specific things, you know, other points. But in the meantime, let's drop down. All right, it says, leaving the Basque people, let us proceed northward. We find on the east, in the hilly savannas, a fairly uniform group of short, dark, broad heads known as Seminoles. So let's drop down a little bit, and we're going to start where it says a little to the north. And it says, a little to the north and west of this alpine wedge is a most interesting group of peoples who have settled for ages in the Dordogne valleys. They comprise folk with very narrow heads who are dark in color and of a low or medium stature. So we're going to go over to page 172, and we're going to look at the bottom portion. So it's bringing us to Brittany, and it says, our next stage brings us to the coast near Brittany. Here again we come on a most interesting and rather difficult problem in European ethnology. The Bretons are largely dark, broad heads, but they are by no means a pure alpine stock. Their language is Brittonic, allied to a Welsh speech, or the Welsh speech. It is believed that many of the Bretons were driven from the west of England by the Saxons about the 5th century AD. Okay, stop right here. We're going to read that a little later on, but let's drop down a little more. Okay, it says, it seems probable that these Bretons are actually descended from the Alpine Celtae who invaded Britain about BC 200 and taught the dark Doketh aboriginals the Welsh tongue. So that's what we need to know right there. All right, I kind of hate that I'm kind of cutting in or going into the British topic, but I mean, that European settlement and migration patterns is very convoluted. But the Alpine Celtae people, you know, at the beginning of this video presentation, we read from two sources, The Place of the Welsh and Riddles of Prehistoric Times, and it's saying the same thing. So we got three sources basically saying the same thing, and then the racial history of man really backs up all of this stuff. So that's enough for now of environment, race, and migration. So what does that tell us? All right, so before we just end this video presentation, pay attention to that keynote slide here where it says early French peoples. Now, to summarize everything, the first peoples in the land comprised of who? Okay, we know that the Proto-Australoids, the Mongoloids, the Proto-Negroes or Negroids, Proto-Negro-Australoid mix, Mediterranean people, Alpine people, Palealpine. I mean, everybody here, I mean, they lived in close proximity to one another. Now, question, did these people just stay separate, or did they mix and mingle with one another? Now, keep in mind that the Proto-Australoid is a Negro with straight hair. The Mongoloids, well, they were Negro people, just of the Mongolian variety. The Proto-Negroes or Negroids, I mean, self-explanatory. Now, the Mediterranean people, you already know they're East Africans, Somalians, Oromo people, and then the Alpine people, they're Negrito, I guess. So, yeah, that's about it. We're going to conclude this video presentation, and hey, big things are coming with early French peoples part 2.